everyone, it's Horror Free For All, and I hope you're doing well today. I have a franchise ranking of a series of films that I absolutely love because, in my opinion, this is one of my favorite horror franchises of all time, maybe next to the Evil Dead films, the Maniac Cop films, the Halloween films, and the Creepshow films and TV show. This franchise, I think, is criminally underrated, kind of forgotten, sadly, but supposedly we're getting a sixth installment in 2025. We'll see when that comes. But I want to kind of put my stamp on this, or I guess re-stamp this, because when I was franchise horror reviews, I did rank these movies. So I'm going to tackle them again, and we're going to be going over the Final Destination films. And if you're wondering what happened to that ranking, I kind of took it down because I immediately started kind of questioning my favorites, I should say. And I actually recently rewatched these in a casual setting, and while most of my ranking has stayed the same, there is a movie that has jumped up considerably, and you will see that, especially if you watch that former video. But I have to say, Final Destination is a franchise that I think ended kind of poignantly in a time when horror kind of needed original franchises. You know, Final Destination, the original movie, came out in the year 2000. It was based on a screenplay by Glenn Morgan, Jeffrey Reddick, and James Wong. And James Wong actually directed the first and third movies. Then you had David R. Ellis, who directed 2 and 4, maybe with different writers. I think Jeffrey Reddick was attached to most, if not all of them, though. And I think a guy named Scott Quayle directed the 5th installment. So it was a series that lasted 11 years, and you got a movie every couple of years. And I remember growing up, every time a Final Destination movie would release, people were hype. And that should tell you something, because in the 2000s, when you think of original horror franchises coming out in that time period, you maybe had Hatchet, Wrong Turn, the Saw movies, and then you had a slew of straight-to-video stuff or remakes. And Final Destination was that kind of like a little engine that could, right? It's a supernatural thriller, but played up like a slasher. And the idea of Final Destination was actually birthed from a X-Files episode pitch from these same creators. And the showrunners of the X-Files thought that the idea was so cool that they should actually pitch that as a film. And lo and behold, it got turned into the movie that we know and love from 2000. And that spawned a 5-film franchise, possibly soon to be a 6th one. And, I think that there's something endearing about these films. And I want to address one of the big things people have to say against it off the bat, is that Final Destination is one of the most formulaic franchises. Yes, but I also think that in a franchise with at least more than 2 entries, their benefits come from nuance. There's familiarity that keeps bringing people back, and I think Final Destination historically has made similar feeling movies, but also made them feel different at the same time. Maybe not one film in particular so much as the other ones, but all of these movies are equally revisitable in some regard, minus one, like I said, in some degree. And I have them here ranked from worst to best, just based on my enjoyment, based on my thoughts on them. So since we only have 5 movies, we might as well get into it. And this is going to come no shock to anyone, especially if you're a longtime Final Destination fan out there. My dead last placement goes to The Final Destination, aka Final Destination 4, aka The Final Destination in 3D. Now, originally, this was supposed to be the final movie of the franchise. But because it was so profitable in the year, I think 2009 when it came out, 2009 was a weird year for horror. You got pretty much the resurgence of remakes starting to come out from Platinum Dunes, and then you had the My Bloody Valentine remake, but also you had 3D horror gimmicks making a rise. And The Final Destination was the second film directed by David R. Ellis, and looking at the writer, It was actually written by Eric Bress, so it had none of the original writers on it. And it kind of shows here. And this is the only film in the franchise that I think is kind of bad. And here's the thing about The Final Destination. After the first movie, the films do become a CGI fest. But the problem with The Final Destination is that majority of the time in most of these films, you have intriguing main characters. You have engaging subplots with these characters. Or in some films, you have shakeups to the formula that kind of add on to the lore and make them stand out in terms of tweaking the concept a little bit. But the Final Destination's biggest notable thing about it is the fact that this was slated to be the final one. So there is some callbacks to Finality and some other movies. But that's probably also one of the biggest detriments to this movie. So this movie, if you're not familiar with the Final Destination franchise, like the other ones, all the films have a visionary that see the future in the beginning of the movie that kind of kicks off the events of the rest of the film. In this vision, they see everybody die, usually before them, and they're the last to die. And once they snap back out of the vision, they start to see that their premonition or deja vu starts to come to them. And in this movie, the visionary is Nick. And Nick is, I guess, a recent college graduate. He has a girlfriend that I think lives with him. And they're at a racetrack. And Nick, along with his girlfriend and a couple of friends and a group of strangers, end up having to navigate escaping the racetrack with their lives. That kind of reformats this design of sorts that's in every movie that involves death itself. Now, this is the biggest gimmick of the Final Destination franchise, is that death is the killer. Death is an invisible, silent murderer, and the only thing we get to witness, minus a few things in certain movies that kind of lend personality to death, all we usually see is that death has set up some elaborate contraption or has come across a string of unlikely occurrences and likes to play around with those things to cause people who evade its design to die. And how it does this is that it essentially creates a pecking order. And minus one film in the franchise that does something different with said pecking order, usually it's framed up like in the order that you would have died if the visionary never stopped it. So this movie's biggest sin is that usually we get to know the characters a little bit, or the plot kind of plays into their dynamics a little bit. In this movie, you already have an existing group of friends that don't care about all the strangers around them. And pretty much the strangers are treated like kill filler. And most of the deaths, which is also another big draw to these movies, are that good. There's a racist guy who gets dragged by a truck and lit on fire. That's not really cool. There's a guy who is actually put in a coma and we never actually get to meet them. And later on in the movie, we get to see kind of two people die at once in a lame fashion due to a ceiling collapse with a bathtub. Really dumb shit. There's a person in the movie who is a security guard who is a callback to another Final Destination 2 character. I don't know if this was David R. Ellis's doing because he directed part 2, but there is something that this movie tries to come back and talk upon, and that is one of the rules, at least in these first 5 movies, that you cannot commit suicide or do self-harm to end your life if you're not next on death's list. And even then, if you're not immediate to die, death doesn't necessarily have to let you just end yourself. You know, sometimes it just depends on what death is feeling. And he dies from pretty much an identical kill that we saw in the first movie with a certain character that we got to see there, involving a bus. And like I said, there is an asshole character in this movie that has probably one of the more famous deaths of the franchise. And during this moment, there is a a sequel scene going on. So the movie kind of spends time trying to build up these two events where there's a girl in the car wash, but the windows have malfunctioned and she can risk drowning or maybe getting decapitated by some car wash things. And then the asshole guy is at a pool and he's lost his lucky coin, so he goes down to retrieve it, but there's a malfunction on the pool pump and let's just say his innards get sucked up out of his ass. Minus that kill, this movie doesn't really have anything else, minus the fact that one thing I think I can appreciate about it is that it does try to do a new concept with like a midpoint reset. Once the survivors go through the intended list, there's pretty much a second part to the movie where they're at the mall, they're about to go see a movie, but the visionary named Nick sees another catastrophic event that involves an explosion and with the escalator, which in turn, destroys the theater and all that. And you have to deal with that in the residuals of whoever's left from the previous list now trying to survive this new event that death has set up. That's pretty much the only thing that's different about it. So yeah, this movie, in terms of pacing, this is like one of the shortest movies of the franchise. It has a brisk pace, but like I said, the characters aren't there. There's really no ambiance to the movie. It's all concept and premise driven. And the biggest suffering point is the kills. I think that there's an escalator kill I forgot to bring up too. The escalator kill and the pool kill are probably the best ones. And like I said, this movie tries to have a bigger scope, but there's not enough time to do this kind of scope. I get it. This was going to be the original final movie. They kind of wanted to have like two different movie plots sandwiched together in one. And trust me, when this movie came out, many theaters were just showing this in 3D. And this movie made a boatload, a fuck ton of money because of the 3D gimmick. And it was so lucrative that they actually made a fifth installment after this because I guess they wanted to make another one to make more money. But also they really wanted to make a better film for the fans. And yeah, I think the CGI effects here probably look the cheapest out of all the movies. The death sequences are unexpired. And like I've already droned on about the characters not being that good. It's just kind of a wash. I'll probably give this movie a 2 out of 5 stars. I watched this one the least, and it's for a good reason. So there you go. All right. My number 4 slot is going to be controversial, I feel, but I feel like given the other movies after this one is a good place to start. And trust me, from here on out, I think all these movies are good or higher. So I have the original Final Destination in number 4. And hear me out. I think in terms of acting, in terms of characters, some of the best of the franchise in terms of storytelling. Because it's the first movie, this movie isn't the most streamlined thing ever because they didn't know what they were going to do later. So with this one being kind of like a test shoot, let's just say, they wanted to go in here and make a lasting movie. But this movie did not perform all that well at the box office because at the time this came out, a certain tragedy with a school shooting happened called Columbine. And I can kind of appreciate this movie for coming out around that time, having the stones to use teenagers in a horror fashion. Because we saw a couple of films in the year 2000 specifically, like Scream 3, that got completely butchered because of that tragedy. And Final Destination, I have to say, starts off the franchise on a good note. You have probably one of the best visionaries in the franchise, Alex. And then Claire, the secondary character, the main secondary character of the movie, is an icon in her own right. She comes back for the second movie, mild spoiler. But yeah, you have Alex and Clear Rivers. And the concept of this one is pretty simple compared to the rest of the films, and I think that's what kind of puts it here. And also the kills aren't the best ever. So you have this class trip to France, essentially, and the main character, Alex, and his best friend and a couple of his classmates are about to get on this flight called Flight 180. Now, Flight 180 is the most pivotal moment of the whole franchise. All the other movies somehow try to call back to this in some way. Even in Final Destination 4, in terms of it fitting into the timeline, which I'll get into near the end of the video, it doesn't really fit because it's kind of like an isolated story compared to some other movies in the franchise. But this one starts off an event that definitely impacts not only one film, but another film that comes later recontextualizes the whole franchise, and that movie impacts this one. So there's three movies really intertwined here. And this now is kind of like the second movie of a trilogy of sorts in terms of timeline here. So with that being said, because those other two movies are associated with it, it kind of hurts it because I love watching timeline order in this franchise. But like I said, it's very simple with the plane, right? Alex sees a vision on the plane. He freaks out. After he sees in the vision that the plane explodes, he convinces a couple of people to leave with him. There's a teacher that reluctantly has to go because it's students involved, and she decides to stay behind. And while in the terminal, they see the plane explode. And in this movie, there's more police involvement. I think the earlier films have more police involvement, as later films, the characters kind of avoid law enforcement or using their help, and they just do everything on their own because the internet became big. But after talking with the police and saying that he literally saw a vision and they're possibly thinking that he's a terrorist or something, Alex and his friends and classmates and even his teacher start to die in weird ways. There's a death involving a shower where a person trips and gets choked to death by a towel dryer hanger, like a wire, in a brutal fashion. We get to meet a legendary side character in this franchise known as Bloodworth, played by Tony Todd, who is kind of like I don't know how to put this, a mortician with some knowledge about death that the main characters kind of need to, get the brain juices flowing. And as the story goes along, and as Alex kind of starts seeing these people die, he notices there's a pattern, and he starts to play around with the idea in his head, and he's looking into it and looking at the seating chart and the arrangements on the plane, thinking back to his vision and who he saw die because he was the last one to die, essentially. He realizes that there's a certain order that they're dying in, and they are dying in order that they should have died on the plane. So as the movie goes along, we see somebody get hit with a bus kind of suddenly. There is a really drawn-out kill in a house involving the teacher, with some freak accidents going on, like multiple things, like a stove being run and a fire catching, a computer exploding because of water getting in it, and shrapnel from the glass, hitting her neck. Very drawn out. And then there's a decapitation by a railroad track for one of these characters. But it builds up to a climax, and the climax really isn't that good. And if you've ever heard about this original intended ending, fuck that ending. Because it involves Alex and Clear kind of moving on in like a poetic way. And I really think that test screening this movie did it justice, because they reshot a new ending for it. And there's a cliffhanger kind of involving that after whoever survived the list thought that they were done doing this, it kind of created the new idea off the bat for the rest of the movies to follow, that the list is never done. You just got to keep going. Like I said, there's more character stuff in this movie. There's more plot. There's more emotions to it than the rest of the franchise, I would say. But like I said, the concept was so fresh and so untapped in terms of potential that I just can't help but put this movie here. I mean, like I said, I'd probably give this movie like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I do think that in terms of like kills, it has some of the more uninspired kills, even though the majority of them are practical, because the franchise at this point hadn't gone full CGI yet, or mostly CGI, so that kind of helps it. But then again, the kills are kind of whatever. There is a concept with the very first death in this movie that implies that death is a sentient entity at least going around, planting all these things and having it happen and then covering up the evidence, but we never really get to see any of that ever tapped into with the rest of the franchise. I'm kind of wondering if they put that in the movie to kind of help the audience think that, oh, yeah, Death is the conniving one, Death is the killer, Death covers up things. But it kind of throws that away for the rest of the movie, and I think maybe if it stuck with that, it would stick out for the rest of the franchise for that reason, but none of the other deaths really feel like that. Like I said, I think it has one of the slower paces to the movie. There's not a lot of characters in this one. It's a smaller cast. So, it takes a while to get to, the good stuff that fans come to these movies for. So that's why it's here, and that's why I gave it the score I did. But it's still a really great movie from the 2000s, let alone a horror movie from the 2000s. And it spawned a franchise that I absolutely love. So I have to give it some respect, but I put it here for a reason. So, at number 3, now this is where, from my original ranking, things have changed. So, I thought long and hard about this, and this movie, I think, deserves this spot, even though it kind of completes a trilogy within the franchise by becoming the first because of the ending. So what I'm going at is that the fifth movie, the first movie, and the second movie are pretty much what I call the Bloodworth trilogy, because all 3 of those films are the only movies in the franchise, so far at least, with Bloodworth in it, and they fit with the original Flight 180 phenomenon. The third and fourth movies kind of feel like standalones. So, because I think this movie sent the franchise off on a good note, I'm willing to put this at number 3. We have Final Destination 5. I know a lot of people are divisive on this movie. Some people think this is one of their favorites of the franchise, and some people think it's one of the worst of the franchise. Hear me out. The visionary in this movie, I want to say his name is Sam. He's not the greatest visionary. He's probably one of the weakest of the whole franchise, probably one of the worst acted in my opinion. With that aside, I think that this movie is fucking awesome. So, like, I've already mildly spoiled it. It's a prequel movie. And the concept of this one is that a group of employees are on a bus. And they're about to head on this bridge to go on this excursion. But on the bridge, there's a series of events that triggers the visionary Sam to have this vision where a bunch of people are stopped. And there's some cracks forming because there's road construction on the bridge. And all of a sudden, the bridge starts collapsing. And one by one, people on this bus start panicking. There's some people left on it. They meet their grisly demise. There's some people trying to run on the bridge. They get hit by obstacles on the bridge. And then, because Sam is the visionary, he's the final one of the survivors in that vision. And he gets to witness everybody die, and we get to see how he dies. But of course, he snaps out of it. He convinces everybody to not go on the bridge, to park the bus off the side. And while they're, just shouting at each other, saying, hey, we're going to miss this retreat, the bridge actually does collapse. Now, because this movie is the fifth one in the franchise, at first, we're kind of thrown off the loop once they're revealed to be, survivors. They pretty much interact with the coroner Bloodworth, and we don't know why he's there and why he's at least at this point of time, if you're watching in sequential order, why he's there as of yet. But like I said, you learn because of the ending that recontextualizes that this is a prequel to the first movie. So we see Bloodworth, and we're probably all hyped for that. And then the survivors start dying in gruesome ways. We see a girl, one of the best deaths of the whole franchise, die in a freak gymnastics accident. Holy fuck. There's a guy, he's going to get acupuncture therapy, and there's a string of events while getting acupuncture that kill him. There's a girl getting laser eye surgery, and you can imagine what that entails. There's a guy who, let's just say, gets hit in the face with a wrench. But this movie, aside from the really cool kills, they do something different with the franchise. I think this movie and the second installment of this series here does the most out of thought, to the typical here. With five, what it tries to do different than the other films is it tries to play around with mechanisms on how to defeat death. The only other movie to, like I said, try this was two. But in this movie, there's a concept kind of introduced through chatting with Bloodworth that you can kind of trade your remaining lifespan with somebody else. So let's just say if you're on death's list because you survived a freak accident and you weren't meant to, you can essentially take somebody's life, and whatever years they had remaining, you get to keep, and death will come for you later. So one character tries to do this with a construction worker that works on site with the company, and let's just say something comes from that. So that character kind of feels safe. But the other characters, they're kind of going through some emotional things, especially with this main character, Sam, and this one side character who kind of snaps. And it kind of becomes like a thriller slasher with this one particular character who specifically wants to kill everybody on the list. Specifically Sam, because there's some blame there. And let's just say, like the former movies, there's more police involvement with this. And there's a police chief kind of looking into this phenomenon. And Sam, like the other Visionaries before, notices this stuff. So Final Destination 5 kind of ends off in a neat bow. Once that whole situation with Sam and the person who's trying to kill him is resolved, and we get to see what comes from that. The remaining survivors are kind of revealed to be at different places, and we get to see Sam and his girlfriend, who were survivors of the events of the movie, going on to Flight 180. And this is the moment that just really makes this movie pop. And we get to see, of course, what happens there for their characters. Final Destination 5, in my opinion, isn't the greatest movie of the franchise. When this came out, they were making this for 3D in mind. So when you do watch this movie, while you can't tell as badly as Part 4, you can see effects that they were trying to emulate 3D in certain deaths. Specifically in the beginning of the movie, I would say you see the most egregious things there about it. But yeah, I saw this movie in 3D when it came out on release weekend with pretty much a whole class of mine that I went to high school with. We all had a ball. It's one of my favorite theater memories. And I don't know if that kind of helps it, but like I said, I do think that this film has bolder swings compared to the rest of the franchise. I do like the fact that it plays around with lore. I think the fact that it's the prequel movie, at least as of now, the only one, it kind of sets itself apart from that. I think it has some of the best kills of the franchise. My only issue with it is that there's no ambiance to the movie. The characters aren't that great, even though they're kind of compelling. They're kind of stock. And I don't like the main visionary, Sam. He's probably my least favorite next to Nick. But I think I like Nick a little bit less. But at least Nick in Part 4. I know Part 4 gets beat the fuck up because it deserves it. But Nick at least had a likable persona to him, and you can kind of see why he had a bunch of friends. With Sam, he's just there in the movie. So, yeah, not the weakest by any means. I think it's a definite step up from the first installment. I'd probably give this movie, in terms of my enjoyment with it, maybe like a 4.25 out of 5 stars. Really solid movie. But now we're in my top 2. And I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with these two movies in particular. And I think I finally settled on this, if only because I think the film I'm putting in second place, while I do think that it's the biggest swing of the franchise, and in a lot of ways it's my favorite utilization of the concept. It has some of my favorite death sequences. I have some of my favorite moments of the whole franchise. It's not that addicting of a movie to watch as my number 1. It's not the most rewatchable one. So in number 2, we actually have Final Destination 2. Now, this is the first of the David R. Ellis movies, and this is another one of those divisive movies in the franchise. I think 2 and 5 are easily the most divisive. But like I've already brought up, this movie takes the most boldest swings in the franchise. And in terms of the movies, this easily feels the most different. Now, with that being said, I think one of the biggest weaknesses to kind of start you off, and this is kind of why I hold it back, is that there's almost too many characters in this movie, and they all feel very stock. And the visionary and the cop, who's I guess the second main character that usually these movies have. You have the visionary and their best friend or sidekick. They're the only two characters that get fleshed out. Not saying that all the movies don't do this, but it's more obvious here than most of the other movies. With that being said, this movie starts off with the visionary Kimberly. She is having some night terrors, and she wakes up to the news kind of talking about Flight 180. And Flight 180, I guess its anniversary is coming up, and she kind of files that in the back of her brain. But it plays into the following events where her and her 3 friends are about to get in a van and go on a road trip out somewhere. And they're about to enter the highway, and when they get on the highway, they're driving around. But let's just say there's a logging truck that loses its logs, and it falls into the road, and it causes a huge traffic accident. And when I say some people die in some fucked up ways in this sequence here, holy fuck. And people are dying left and right. Kimberly and her friends, they're all, rolling around, tumbling around in their van. They end up in a certain position, and all 4 of them are actually said to die at once in the vision. But once that comes to fruition, Kimberly, of course, snaps out of it. She's the first in line on the exit ramp. She decides to block traffic and put her friends out in the van, and she says, we need to not get on the highway. There's about to be a big accident. Luckily, there's a cop nearby. The cop's asking what's going on, and she's like, I saw it. It was like real or something. And then, as she's talking with the cop, her friends in the van actually get hit by a truck and killed instantly. And we see the whole, well, I guess off screen, the traffic accident ensue in real time. Now, the remaining survivors are all shaken up. They're all taken back to the police station, and they're pretty much interrogated about what transpired on the exit ramp. And they're like, we don't know what happened, but all we know is that maybe this girl did see something, and, let's just be grateful we're all alive. Well, Kimberly, while she's talking to the police seem to think that this might have some correlation to the previous visionary we saw in the first movie, Alex Browning, and the phenomenon of the survivors there, but they're not sure yet. And they're not sure of the validity on that. So Kimberly, she is, going through the motions of emotions and all that, and she's looking into Flight 180 on her own, and notices the similarities and some other events that happen off screen. I think there's like a Lakeview fire incident that gets brought up on the internet and all that. She comes to an idea that people are going to die because this feels exactly like what she went through. And we get to see some people die pretty early on. But the twist to this movie, unlike the rest of the films of the franchise, is that Death has decided to use a reverse list. But there's a reason why he's using a reverse list. And what I mean by that is, usually they'll go in terms of order. Like, if you're supposed to die first, you're going to be first on the list. But in this movie, he does, if you died last, you're actually going first. But Kimberly already cheated Death, so she's safe for a while, and she's the visionary, but her friends ate the dust. So, we see people in reverse order start to die. There's a guy that gets, through a string of events, he gets impaled through the eye with a ladder from a fire escape. There's a kid that gets smushed at a dentist office by a collapsing window pane. There's a woman who gets decapitated by an elevator. Like I already brought up in Final Destination 4, there's a guy who tries to essentially commit suicide, but the gun is jammed and he can't do it because he's not next. You might recognize this movie, of course, for a specific scene involving a woman being impaled because an airbag deploys and there's a sharp object behind her head, and there's a guy that gets sliced and diced by I think a barbed wire fence. But there's more to that, because as the movie goes along, Kimberly, she gets to meet Clear Rivers, who is pretty much the sole survivor left of the Flight 180 list. And in doing so, she visits Clear, who's in a padded cell. She's put her there voluntarily so death can't easily get her. And she's talking with Clear and thinks that she's given up and could really use her help. And they start, working together once Clear comes to her senses and thinks about what Alex would have wanted to do. And she decides to help him. But they realize that Death has a different design here. And the reason why he's gone in reverse order is that in this movie, all the survivors that were supposed to die but didn't on the exit ramp were actually leftovers for things that the survivors of the first movie from Flight 180 did because they didn't die. For example, one girl was late because the girl that got hit by the bus in the first movie caused her to miss her death. There's a guy who had a police partner, the police chief guy. He didn't die the night he was supposed to die because, let's just say, a certain person that got decapitated by the railroad tracks had him tied up. There's many other incidents of that. So it cleverly ties into the movie before it, kind of building on the lore and how Death operates. And it builds up into a climax where they have this idea, because this movie's so experimental, it's also playing around with the idea of how do you cheat death. And they go to Bloodworth, and Bloodworth gives them the new idea that new life negates the list. So let's say somebody's on the list and they give birth or they father a child and that child manages to come to existence, the death's list is null and void. And they think that this one pregnant woman is the key to all their problems, but it turns out maybe or maybe not, she was never going to die. So this inspires the visionary Kimberly to do a drastic decision, because she kind of interprets it like, well, if new life can negate death's list, what about if you die and then you come back to life? That's also another thing the movie kind of comes to do. And that plays into the climax. And the remaining survivors, I think, has probably the least amount of survivors of all the movies. They're out hanging around, having a barbecue with a certain character that maybe was saved by another character, which plays into the theme of the movie. And we see this character die, and it's kind of recontextualized that they were actually a survivor from the Lakeview fire that we saw on the internet before. And maybe that death's list possibly isn't over. But to me, that's where my headcanon ends for those three movies, like I brought up, 5, 1, and 2. The rest of the movies kind of break canon. And to me, 2 is pretty much the perfect movie, minus, like I said, the characters are kind of dry and there's not a lot of ambiance. But in terms of idea execution, I think this is the best. But I don't think this is the best movie, sadly. But I do love this. I'll probably give this like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. My number 1, by process of elimination, then has to go to the third installment, Final Destination 3. This was the second film by James Wong, and a lot of people seem to think that this is the best Final Destination movie. And I have to say, in terms of rewatchability, in terms of the kills and deaths in this movie, in terms of ambiance, in terms of just vibes, mood, this has it. Like, this is, I think, the best movie for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons, okay? Final Destination 3, by all means, is a tweaked version of the first movie, because you have more of the original team that worked on the first movie working on this project, because they kind of wanted to restore it after Final Destination 2 was kind of a mild bomb at the box office like the first movie. Final Destination 3 was actually their first hit, and I think a lot of it had to deal with the poster and the trailer of this thing, showcasing that it takes place at an amusement park and involves a roller coaster vision. And that's probably one of the best things about this movie is that it's incredibly atmospheric in a small town with an amusement park going on. But one thing to say that I have a negative with about this movie off the bat is that this breaks canon of the timeline that we would come to know with 5, 1, and 2, because the survivors of 2, who are said to have completely deleted the list, actually died due to unexplained phenomenon off screen in this movie. And this movie also kind of suffers, in my opinion, for feeling more standalone, and it doesn't really fit like it fits in with 5, 1, and 2 in terms of Flight 180. Even though this movie tries to reference it, it just doesn't really feel like it ties good with those. But there is some cool concepts here that I think it does differently than the first movie. And I do think that this probably has my favorite Visionary. Maybe not the best, but the Visionary played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Wendy. She's fantastic in this movie. So the concept of this one is that we go back to high schoolers, unlike the second movie, the fourth movie, and the fifth movie, who are all adults. High schoolers here, they are at the amusement park. It's summertime. They're enjoying, their senior year. They're about to graduate soon. And they decide to all want to ride this roller coaster. But Wendy, she's an avid photographer. She's taking pictures of all of her friends at this carnival place, it looks like. She seems to be kind of nervous about this roller coaster because it has like a devil theme and it seems to be talking to her. And she's kind of, apprehensive to go on it. But all of her friends and some fellow classmates, they enter the line to get on the roller coaster, including her boyfriend. And they get on the roller coaster, but because this is Final Destination, we get to see all these characters die in freakish, kind of horrifying ways on this roller coaster during the vision. And of course, because Wendy's the visionary, she dies last. And when she snaps out of it, she freaks out, tells the ride operator to stop the roller coaster. The roller coaster is going to crash. There's something wrong with the brakes. She's very specific. She's like, we can't get on this. We shouldn't be riding this. She causes a commotion where a few people get off because they're pissed off. A few people get kicked off and whatnot. And they're all escorted off with Wendy. But unfortunately for her, she had to leave behind her boyfriend who still wanted to ride it. And let's just say the roller coaster tragedy happened. And all these teenagers now have to mourn the deaths of all these people that they knew that were on the roller coaster at school. And while at school, Wendy's kind of being ostracized by her peers. They don't know if maybe she sabotaged the roller coaster herself, or maybe she's just crazy. But this one guy who's played by Ryan Merriman, who was a former DCOM star, he was kind of a good friend with her boyfriend, but him and her haven't historically gotten along. He becomes like her sidekick when he starts to take her side, and he's asking what happened. She's like, look, I saw it happen. You have to believe me. And then, of course, like the other movies, people start dying. There's the iconic tanning bath death with 2 naked girls. That happens, yeah. And then, of course, later on, there's a guy that he's in like a drive-through line, and an engine pops out of a car, hits him in the back of the head. There's a guy working out with weights, and he accidentally hits something, which triggers these swords to come down and pretty much, cut the wires to his equipment, and let's just say he gets crushed. There's a girl that has a grisly death with some nail guns. There's a girl that gets impaled. There's a guy that gets literally squished to death by a falling, I think it's like a dolly lift or one of those huge pieces of industrial equipment with like a big board for lifting things. It's pretty brutal. But yeah, you have your good deaths here. But what makes this movie a little bit different compared to the others is how the visions are handled. Normally, each movie has the main character kind of looking for signs. I haven't brought that point up because I was saving it for this. The signs of each movie kind of vary. Like in the beginning with Alex, he'll see something like a shadow pass, or he'll see like something weird on a piece of paper that kind of triggers in his head, hey, somebody's going to die from this. make them think of like whatever. The second movie, similar thing, where more characters start to play around with it, and it's not just the visionary seeing the signs. The first movie had like clear seeing the signs too, but the second movie kind of played on that. But the third movie, unlike the other movies that don't even hardly ever touch on it, the photos she took in the beginning of the movie all are the signs itself. So she's sifting through the photos she took that night during her grieving process of all these events, and she's talking to her sister about it. And she notices that the people that are dying have similar things, or, I guess visionary metaphors in the photos. So she starts to pinpoint the order of people who died, and she starts to recognize that, hey, maybe this can involve this or that. And she tries to convince a few other people, which kind of backfires and sets one off into a murderous rampage. And he actually tries to kill her, which is kind of reminiscent to part 5 a little bit. But you have that angle here. And it kind of ends in a climactic finish, let's just say, back at a fairground. So we start off in a carnival amusement park, and then we end on a fairground note. And then once the situation seems resolved, like the other movies, there's actually something different here as well. There's a recontextualization with a certain character possibly being on the roller coaster that Wendy was not accounting for, which was odd, but I thought that was really cool. And then, but like I said, like the other movies, we get caught up to speed in the events at the end of the movie. There's some time that's elapsed, but unlike the other movies, this movie kind of ends on a brand new vision and a brand new death sequence to kind of send off the film. And I think it sends it off in a pretty neat way. And let's just say it involves a subway crash. So yeah, Final Destination 3, I think is the best movie because it has the best ambiance, and it has just the most addicting watch to it. The characters here are probably the most entertaining. I do think that the franchise shines its highest when it's using teenagers as the main characters. I do think that there's enough here to kind of carry this movie on its own, like with the whole visionary aspect, being able to use photographs that she took. I think that's a neat way to kind of diversify from everything else. I think collectively this has some of the best kills of the whole franchise too. I mean, every death sequence in this movie isn't forgettable. I mean, you can literally just think back on to every death of this movie and be like, oh shit, that was fucking gnarly. And honestly, a lot of people say that this is their favorite, and I can see why. It originally was my number 3, but this has climbed up 2 placements as my number 1. My only big drawback with this movie, like I said, is that it breaks canon from 1 and 2, and then later on 5. And it doesn't really feel like it fits with those. This kind of feels like its own standalone movie, which I guess if you don't care about that stuff, this might actually help it for you. And I weirdly like it for that way in some regards, but I don't like that it doesn't fit that well into the previous 2 movies. And then again, like I said, it breaks the canon that I did not want to see happen with the characters at the end of 2. Does things off screen with them unceremoniously. But that's also another thing that 2 did. I forgot to bring that up with Alex. But besides the point, this one I'd probably give the same score as 2, like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. But I just like this one more. And if you're a massive fan of this movie, this is the one film of the franchise that has the create your own movie feature, where you can do the choose your own adventure version of the movie. Use at your own leisure. But I do think that it's fun, and there are some cool things about it for me to recommend that you go experience it. So all in all, Final Destination, the movies, I think that this is a pretty phenomenal franchise, minus the 1 entry, the 4th entry specifically. This is a really strong franchise, one of the most strong, I would say. Now, some people out there think that these movies are overrated. Some people think that they're kind of gimmicky, one-trick ponies, which is kind of fair. But then again, all these movies are entertainment at the end of the day. And I think that this franchise thoroughly entertains me, whether I'm watching the first movie, which kind of starts it all, where I'm getting most of my enjoyment, is part 5, 2, and 3. And then part 4, I can kind of appreciate some things about it, but it's kind of a bad movie, all said and done. But I will say this, Final Destination is one of those franchises that can continue for a long time as long as it keeps the formula right. This is kind of like A Nightmare on Elm Street, where they kind of had that first movie, and then later on they experimented around, and then it kind of found its footing a little bit. But unfortunately for A Nightmare on Elm Street, things flew off the rails, and the quality started to suffer. Where here, I think the quality, for the most part, maintained a steady course and, of course, improved over time. We saw, parts 3, 4, and 5 were extremely profitable. And 3 is definitely the fan favorite. While you have 2 and 5 that are divisive, and 1 was not financially successful, but is popular within the fan base. Majority of these movies have made a lasting impact on people, especially my generation, and I really love these. I really do. And the fact that it was birthed from an X-Files episode pitch, and it became this, is fascinating to me, and I'll always remember that about these. And honestly, Death, probably one of the greatest horror villains of all time. Even though you never get to see the guy or her or it, whatever you want to call it, Death has some of the most creative kills I've ever seen in any horror film franchise. So take that for what you will. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Final Destination franchise. Let me know down in the comment section how you would rate these movies from worst to best, or I guess your least favorite to favorite. I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.